In parts 1 through 4 of this series, we examined blood flow through the chambers of the heart, electrical conduction in the heart, setting up a heart monitor to get a visual of the rhythm, and breaking down the strip paper and how to use that to measure aspects of a rhythm. That all lays out a necessary foundation for you to be able to look at a strip and understand how different arrhythmias will affect your patients. Now, let's bring all those things together and start to break down a single heartbeat. Here's the heart. And as previously explained, the best lead to view for overall interpretation is lead 2. So that's what we'll view here. Before the next heartbeat starts, there is a nice quiet gap following the end of the previous beat. That flat, uneventful period of the strip is part of the diastolic phase of the cardiac cycle. While nothing seems to be going on electrically, blood is passively filling the ventricles to that 70 to 80% capacity. And then, in a perfect heartbeat, our action potential initiates an impulse at the SA node, causing depolarization of the atrium, and with depolarization, we get contraction, which pushes the atrial kick blood volume, that final 20 to 30% of blood, to fill the ventricles up to 100% capacity. On the lead 2 strip, we see a small positively inflected little bump, known as the P wave. Why is the P wave positively inflected in lead 2? From the SA node, the impulse depolarizes down toward the AV node, in the direction of the positive pole of lead 2, and when an impulse moves towards a positive pole, the rhythm moves above the baseline, or is positively inflected. So, we see the positively inflected P wave, and that tells us some important things about the heart. If we have a P wave, we have atrial depolarization. If we have atrial depolarization, and everything is functioning the way that it's supposed to, we have atrial contraction, and atrial contraction provides atrial kick blood into the ventricles. Putting the P wave into the cardiac cycle, the P wave represents the atrial systolic phase. Now, if the P wave doesn't occur, we lose the atrial kick, meaning our ventricles will never be able to fill past that 70 to 80% capacity, and we lose 20 to 30% of our desired cardiac output as a result. Back to our perfect beat though, following the P wave, we have a short period where the tracing, that's what they call the drawing of the rhythm, rests at the baseline. Electrically, we don't see anything going on, but in the heart, our impulse has reached the AV junction, and the AV junction slows down the speed of conduction and separates the atrial depolarization from the ventricular depolarization. Since there aren't a ton of cells in the AV junction, there's not enough energy being released to show up on the strip. So while the impulse moves through the AV node and the bundle of His, we get a flat section on the strip known as the PR segment. When you see the PR segment, you know energy is currently moving from the atrium through the AV junction and toward the ventricle. And we can now do our first important measurement of our rhythm. We're going to measure something called the PR interval. The PR interval is the measurement from the beginning of the P wave, the point where it first jumps off the baseline, showing that initial release of the action potential at the SA node, and goes until the end of the PR segment, stopping where the tracing jumps off the baseline again into our next complex. So the PR interval measurement represents how long it takes an impulse to depolarize the atrium, right up to the point where it releases from the bundle of His into the ventricles. When we think about blood flow, the PR interval is all about atrial kick. The atrial contraction is the squeeze, but remember, the reason we have to separate atrial contraction from ventricular contraction is to allow time for blood to physically move into the ventricles. So the PR interval has to be long enough to allow time for the atrial kick blood to travel physically into the ventricles before the next part of the heartbeat. And what is long enough? The PR interval should measure between 0.12 and 0.20 seconds, or 3 to 5 small boxes. Anything shorter than 0.12 seconds, and there isn't enough time to get all the blood moved, and we lose some of our atrial kick volume. Anything longer than 0.20 seconds, and there's no real problem with blood movement. But it does mean something isn't working quite right, and we'll cover that in a later video. And then we see the next piece of our heartbeat. This enormous complex jumps onto the strip. What do you think that represents? Our impulse just released from the end of the bundle of His. So what happens next? It travels through the left and right bundle branches, depolarizing the ventricles. And with ventricular depolarization, we get ventricular contraction. which provides cardiac output to be supplied throughout the body. On the strip, we see that huge complex. This is known as the QRS complex. So, when you see a QRS complex, you know you have ventricular depolarization, giving us ventricular contraction and providing the body with cardiac output from the ventricles. Where does the QRS fit into the cardiac cycle? We just had atrial systole with the P wave, and the QRS is the representation of ventricular systole, and also the focus of our next important measurement. We want to measure the QRS complex. How long does it take to depolarize and contract those ventricles? Start this measurement at the same place that we finished the PR interval measurement, the first change in inflection after the end of the P wave. A picture-perfect QRS complex goes below the baseline, turns and shoots up before dropping back down below and then returning to the baseline. But not every QRS is picture-perfect, so the first change in inflection could be down, or it could be shooting up initially. Ultimately, on a 5-lead, I'm not overly concerned about the nuances of the inflections. Just understand that you start this measurement and end your PR interval measurement, where the tracing goes in either direction to start the QRS. Ending the measurement is a little less clear. Sometimes you look out and it just comes right back to the baseline, takes a hard turn, and you have a definitive corner to put your calipers on. Sometimes, though, the QRS gently curves back into the baseline. We're looking for something called the J point, or junction point. A different junction than the AV junction, sorry if that's confusing. This is the junction between the QRS and the ST segment. It is defined as the point where the tracing changes from primarily moving vertically to primarily moving horizontally. And when you're looking at a curve, that point is the top or apex of the curve. So when you have that gentle change from QRS to ST segment, find the apex of the curve and place your caliper on that point. It sounds easy enough, but that curve isn't always very large. And that might be really frustrating, but it's actually a good thing. It means the margin of error will be very low and shouldn't dramatically affect your measurement. So do the best you can. There are other times when the QRS is oddly shaped and the J point can be very challenging to locate, and we'll see some examples of that as we move through our various arrhythmias in this series. Focusing for a second on the shape of the QRS as it relates to lead 2, the QRS has portions above and below the baseline, and that's because the bundle branches carry that impulse in different directions along the path. Initially, we see a negatively inflected portion. That's right as the impulse is releasing from the bundle of His, and there isn't a lot of space here, or aggressive directional movement. It shows up as a small negative inflection, implying more energy is moving up than down, before it really breaks into those bundle branches. And unfortunately, my picture doesn't do a great job of depicting this. The initial direction of the bundle branches is aggressively down, toward the positive pole. There is a lot of space here and a lot of cells to release energy. So we end up with a very large amplitude, positively inflected spike. But then, the bundle branches reach the bottom of the ventricle, and they turn, curling up toward the top of the heart, toward the negative pole. So we again see the tracing become negatively inflected, depicting that change in direction of depolarization. So we've measured from the beginning of the QRS to the J point. How long should it take? Between 0.06 and 0.12 seconds. That's 1.5 small boxes, and I know I said generally round to the nearest small box, but this is the exception to the rule. So 1.5 up to 3 small boxes. That makes it very quick, providing a nice, forceful push to circulate blood through the body. What happens if we don't have a QRS complex? Missing a P wave, we lost 20 to 30% of our output, but missing a QRS? We lose 100% of our output. With no ventricular contraction, there is no cardiac output. But this beat has a QRS. So what happens next? The heart is used up. Cells are depolarized, and if we want to have another heartbeat, they need to repolarize. And that starts as soon as the QRS is finished. But initially, you won't see much of anything on the strip. There isn't enough electrolyte movement yet to really show up on the tracing, and we get this flat section following the QRS, called the ST segment. This should be flat on the baseline. In some patients, though, you may see it lifted above or dropping below the baseline, and we'll touch on that in a future video. Following the ST segment, we see more movement on the strip. this time in the form of a large positively inflected bump, known as a T wave. The T wave shows up when those electrolytes really start moving back into place, repolarizing the cells of the ventricles. So the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. Fitting this into the cardiac cycle, when the QRS ended, the ventricular systolic phase ended. So we're back into diastole. As soon as the ventricles are done contracting, they start passively filling back up with blood. Even though we see movement on the strip with the T wave, it doesn't represent any contraction in the heart. So while the cells recharge for the next beat, the heart is just filling the ventricles with that 70 to 80% capacity and getting ready to cycle back through the atrial and then ventricular systolic phases. And with the completion of the T wave, we are now able to complete our third important measurement, the QT interval. This measurement begins at the start of the QRS, the same place we ended the PR interval measurement and the same place we began the QRS complex measurement. And it goes to the end of the T wave. And again, some T waves come to the baseline and take a hard turn, giving a decisive stopping point, and others gently blend back in. I don't have a detailed explanation on when to stop for this. The definition is that it ends when it reaches the baseline. So do the best you can when you run into these challenging T waves. So what does this measurement show? It includes ventricular depolarization, all the way through the completion of ventricular repolarization. So it's basically giving you the ventricular time frame of a beat. How long does it take a ventricle to be used up and then be ready to be used again? And we want that time frame to be less than or equal to 0.44 seconds, or 11 small boxes. Anything longer than 0.44 seconds is referred to as a prolonged QT and puts the patient at risk for development of lethal arrhythmias related to something called R-on-T phenomenon. We'll cover that in detail in a later video. And that's a heartbeat. P wave, followed by QRS complex, followed by a T wave. Just a few blips on paper, but they represent life. And when things start to go wrong with these little blips, it's up to us to recognize that and know what to do to keep our patients safe. So in our next video, we'll look at how to systematically break down a rhythm for interpretation.